Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Pitts. I'm really pleased I'm part of this event today from the ECA, and it's fantastic to see the ECA commit so clearly and practically towards this net zero transition. So I'm going to set a bit of the context around the change around net zero heat. I work for Innovate UK, which is the UK government's innovation agency. We see the net zero transition as absolutely fundamental to the future of the economy for the UK. We want the UK to prosper from being the fastest transitioning economy to net zero. As an organisation, we support businesses to go faster. Our job is to make sure we can remove the barriers to companies innovating so they can grow, hire people, grow the UK economy. We do that by helping companies move faster than they can on their own, helping them see their place in that future economy, and also making sure that the impact of that kind of growth for society and the environment is known as well as just the economy. Over the last 5 years, Innovate UK have supported almost 6,000 companies with net zero related grants and awarded almost 2 billion. That's been matched by something like 4.8 billion of private investment. That's led to the growth in the UK economy that's grown 67,000 jobs, 190 billion of exports. And those businesses themselves have invested another 10 billion in R&D. Over the coming 3 years, we'll provide another 3 billion of net zero funding. Our priorities and themes around net zero are very much based upon the sixth carbon budget from the Climate Change Committee. We're looking at the big 4 chunky systems that need to change. And they are the big 4 non-land use change emissions areas. So the first of those is mobility. How we move around in a net zero way. Then power, how do we deliver the energy we need to thrive as an economy in a net zero way. Then there's make and use, so how do we decarbonise our industry and the way we use products. And the last, the most important one, of course, I would say is heat. Now, how do we get off gas for heating space and water in buildings. Underpinning all of that, we have some cross-cutting themes around place, so doing this in a place-based way, which is net zero living. How do we deliver finance for businesses to move into net zero and consumers? And last of all, the issues around critical materials. So for things like batteries and photovoltaics, we need to make sure that we've managed those kind of supply chains within the UK. So the sixth carbon budget from the Climate Change Committee lays out the kind of pathways over the next 20, 30 years, basically taking us to about 2030, 2035. We're focusing on that because that's when some of the biggest change has to happen. And in the next 5 to 10 years is when most of that innovation needs to come on board to scale up what we're doing. Emissions kind of fall fastest in that space when we start to use a lot of these solutions at scale. And we'll talk a bit today about the heat side of things. But right now, as you've maybe heard quite recently, there's a lot of concern about how well we're on the path for that. In terms of dealing with buildings, we need to transition very fast to low carbon heat. We need to deal also with demand by boosting efficiency. Those kind of things aren't on track right now. And we see ECA members as a big part of that transition. We've been doing a really good job in the UK of getting off fossil fuels for our energy and our electricity, but we haven't done a very good job at all with heat, which is a bigger challenge. And of course, it's much more seasonal. And over the last few years, we've really started to understand, of course, the issues around energy security with things like the war in Ukraine and how important it is for us to move away from gas. Got some charts up here around the kind of energy flows within the UK. This is national grid data that shows just how much of our energy in residential and commercial buildings comes from natural gas right now. And the scale of that challenge for us to shift off it, it's also pretty large for the kind of mobility area as well. But by 2050, this is the kind of mix we're going to be looking at. All predominantly moving to electricity-based heating for buildings, using a decarbonised grid. And that's a huge challenge in terms of rollout. And the sixth carbon budget kind of lays out what that pathway looks like. And we know that means a big boost in the use of decarbonised heating. So in net zero heat, we align not only with the issues for the sixth carbon budget, but we also look very carefully at the government and its heat and building strategy. And you can see within that heat within buildings is around 23% of UK emissions. The breakdown in the kind of things we're going to have to deliver are improved thermal performance, decarbonised heating through things like heat pumps. The UK government's very focused on heat pumps and heat networks. But in terms of policy to deliver that, we still have large gaps. Both the Climate Change Committee progress report and some other analysis from people like Bankers for Net Zero, who are looking very much at how we finance this transition, can see there's some big gaps still there. And a lot of that's understanding how we can do it. And that's where the innovation side of things comes in. We can really shape how that transition will look. And the programme works hard across that. And I'll kind of go through that a bit today. The day we were recording this, the previous day was when the Climate Change Committee put their latest update on where the state of play was in the transition. And that policy gap analysis says over the last 8 years, looking back in terms of the amount of decarbonisation that's happened and the amount needed in the coming 8 years, electricity supply is well on track. Decarbonising industry's got a bit of a challenge, but probably the biggest one and a big issue in terms of the scale of the transition is still around surface transport, so the mobility side of things, and buildings. So how big is this challenge? We're really looking at decarbonising something like 30 million buildings between now and 2050. So very quickly we're going to need to be doing 1 million buildings a year. That might sound like a lot. 3 million homes a year get a new bathroom and kitchen. So the scale of disruption's probably acceptable for consumers, but they don't really know what it is they've got to do. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And some of the policy stuff still isn't clear then. So there is some policy mooted around things like making homes have to be a certain EPC, Energy Performance Certificate, by a certain date for renters and for sale. There'll be a ban on new gas boilers in new build homes and probably eventually in all homes. Predicated on that, of course, is some things like heat pump costs coming down over time. And that's where we're going to talk about some of those things today. But the benefits of moving to decarbonised heating are huge for consumers and the economy. There'll be a huge growth. Basically, the renovation of homes sector needs to be about 10 times bigger. We think it could be something like $500 billion in terms of GDP in doing this, hundreds of thousands of new jobs, reduced costs, not having to build so many power stations, improved energy security, reducing fuel poverty, and healthier buildings. A big aim in a lot of this is to have homes that are far healthier. So with the Net Zero Heat Challenge at Innovate UK, really what we're looking at is how we can help innovate around the wider system change. As I've already said, there's huge commitment from the government, in particular the Department for Net Zero and Energy Security, in delivering a scale up in heat pumps, a transition in the way we power all our homes. What we're trying to do is fill in some of those kind of systemic challenges around the edge. And that means 3 things for us. The first one is helping secure market demand. That means standardized information about what renovation to do, when, what that will cost, and guarantees over the outcome. For consumers to make those informed decisions, we need a much more data-driven transition. The second one is to overcome some of the systemic barriers that companies face in scaling out. The technologies for the net zero heat transition largely exist. It's how they all work together and how they're deployed at scale that's the problem. And we're working with some of the businesses that have those technologies to understand what's stopping them scaling faster and how we can help them. Because that innovation has been stuff that we have supported. And last of all, we're trying at the moment to think about how we can rethink the entire process of net zero renovation in a home. How do we get all the different people who are involved in that kind of system and help them work together to rethink the approach so that it can be industrialized and scaled up? Right now, really the way we do a lot of net zero renovation is very akin to kind of a craft industry or a very high-end kitchen fitters who come in and do a very bespoke and really powerfully beautiful job. We need the kind of IKEAization of kitchens done for net zero renovation. And again, that's where ECA members can play a huge role. So what we're talking about really is, how we go from the kind of old housing stock we've got to the modern housing stock of the future. How do we wrap our homes, do the kind of electrified heat installations, sensors, thinking about things like ventilation, so that homes are healthy, and you've got a better outcome for the occupants, and doing that at scale and quickly. So let's go through those three things first. So first of all, the kind of data-driven approach for dealing with demand. One of the things that we're funding is a unified stock model for the whole of the UK. So we understand the condition of the buildings that are in now. We then are going to map that with the data that exists for the energy infrastructure. So we understand how we can scale delivery of electrified heat in a way that doesn't tip the power grid over. And there we're working with our Net Zero Power colleagues. On top of that, we're trying to ground truth and understand and get some greater granular detail about the actual condition of those homes. So although we may have lots of homes that are the same kind of design, lots of things will happen over their time, and they'll be in different levels of condition. So in terms of ground truthing, we're sending out all sorts of very fancy scanning technology on the back of vehicles, a bit like Google cars, Google Earth vehicles going around and scanning buildings to kind of colour that kind of point map in. And we're also exploring the possibility of doing a lot of that using satellites from space. And that's one of the powers of Innovate UK, is that we can work with aligned sectors and pull businesses together that have got different angles on the same problem. When you've got all of that, we then want to take data from actual renovations and understand what was achieved and feed that back into that model, so we understand the correct pathways for upgrades. For some buildings, just installing the right kind of decarbonised heat will be enough. For others, we'll have to address the fabric of the building as well. Really kind of getting some firm understanding of how we do that properly, we want to think about how we can measure all of this in real time. So this is another big challenge, how we can understand the performance of that building in terms of heat loss. The UK has the leakiest homes in Europe. That's largely because we have the oldest building stock. And that can vary depending on how well the building's been built together. So when you heat a building up, how quickly does it lose that heat? And understanding the mechanisms by which that happens, and being able to do that in real time, at low cost, in as short a time as possible, really helps those projects happen. And we're also supporting a variety of projects to do that. Because right now, the EPC model basically takes it's a modelled scenario. You're taking a lot of data and assuming because you've put all these things in, it'll work as it should. That's not good enough in terms of guarantees for consumers. This is a big opportunity. Moving on to system barriers, looking at the kind of businesses there. We want to tackle some of those system barriers that businesses are facing. A big one of those is things like certification. How do you get finance for projects? A lot of the scale out that's happening now is in social homes. And that is happening particularly with government funded programs like the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, or things through your energy bills and paying it through ECO. Although ECO is becoming less and less effective over time. But for innovative solutions to become part of those programs, they have to be accredited both under the SAP regime to show that they actually make a difference in EPC, and for installation. It's where you and your members come in, is thinking about compliance with PAS 2030 and PAS 2035. But the real issue in this space is who's going to aggregate the demand, who's going to provide the solutions directly to building owners, whether that's social housing, whether that's commercial buildings, whether that's kind of private owned buildings. Those aggregators who sit in the centre of it all, that are trusted. They'll be pulling in the supply chain of these kind of technology businesses. They'll be working directly with people who know how to do installations safely and correctly. And crucially, they're going to have to lever in the kind of finance needed, whether that's from green mortgages or other kind of loan products. Pulling all of that together and providing an integrated offering to building owners. And this is the space we're seeing that's most exciting right now. And this is why it's a really important time to engage with this and become part of these kind of growing new ecosystems. We think in the future, potentially it'll be local authorities delivering some of this at a large scale level. And there's quite a few we're working with in the Net Zero Living programme who are really keen to do that in an integrated way, together with things like EV charging. Skills is also a huge issue here. So we've got organisations like the Retrofit Academy trying to train an army of retrofit coordinators and come out and look at your home using the kind of data we've talked about and give you the right kind of pathway for your building and your occupancy the building and what you want are separate sets of data in some ways. And that last piece I talked about was how do we rethink the entire process of net zero renovation, end to end? How do we start to industrialize it? How do we think about bringing all the experts together who might have a view on this? And again, drawing on the Innovate UK network where we can pull in expertise from other sectors, robotics, digital scanning, high value manufacturing that know how to think about an entire process in a different way, together with those delivering these kind of solutions right now, to prepare and design the approach so that it is scalable. We've had huge success in doing that, and collaborative R&D projects that Innovate UK deliver. One of the biggest legacies from them is that collaboration that endures afterwards. Businesses from different sectors learning how to work together and realizing between them they have all the answers to the problems. And that's what a lot of our money is providing in the grants we give, is that we're sharing the risk with you and doing something earlier than you would so that you go faster together. I've recently finished a large program called Transforming Construction, and as part of that we looked at how we rethink the building of things like hospitals and schools, how we can bring together different components for a building in a much more manufacturing type approach. And one of the big enduring lessons there for modern tier one contractors who do this is to say, actually we can work with these different supply chains. Our job is how we bring all of those things together on site. And some of the tier one contractors that started out as skeptics are now evangelists for this approach because they've seen the results for themselves. They've seen examples of where right at the start you might spend more money getting the footings of the building correct, using laser cut, some laser cut rebar rather than getting some guy down on their hands twisting metal. But finding the improved accuracy at that point makes every other part of the process after that faster and lower cost and greater accuracy. So thinking about something as a system, you can often get those bigger benefits. And that's what we're doing in terms of bringing people together as part of an innovation lab to relook at this. Because what you see as you start to think about industrialization is things come down in cost over time, those cost curves, those technology cost curves we see. And you can see this particularly with things like renewables. It's absolutely bonkers just how fast the cost of solar has come down as it's scaled up. So each doubling of installed solar capacity, the cost of solar electricity has declined by around 36%. That's the kind of learning rate. And we haven't bottomed it out yet. That's still been the case as we've improved in scale. Seen a similar thing for both offshore and onshore wind, whereas nuclear is getting more expensive the more we install it. The history of solar PV deployment is accelerating all of the time, and that's because of these cost curves. We're seeing the same sorts of things now with batteries, and we're starting to expect to see the same sorts of things as we install electrified heating solutions as well. Heat pumps will come down in cost over time as we scale them up, if we do it correctly. And the last opportunity here around this is to think about the building now as an active component within the energy network. Rather than being a load that's drawing down energy and largely heating up the environment around it, instead we can think about buildings as being active components where they generate, store and manage their own energy. So that might include installed PV, that might include heat batteries, electricity batteries, other forms of storage and generation, and flexibility that allows it to work within a much more flexible energy system. And looking at some of the kind of tariffs and business models that would deliver some of that and who would manage them. We've been funding work in this area for a while, and again, massive opportunity for ECA members to be involved in installing buildings that are active, more responsive, and provide a better solution for the tenants, as well as helping the energy system be much more responsive. We've seen some of this in the forms of kind of externalized energy pods during retrofits, which can still be used on new builds as well. So putting everything you kind of need, including things like ventilation systems and being able to change filters on the outside of the building, which can have an aesthetic improvement for that building, create more space, create a porch space, or in the case of some of the high-rise ones, we can we can improve the kind of external space that buildings have, provide a benefit to the tenants. But what we've really learned with all of this, and what's really powerful, is that for new build, if we get that kind of thinking in right at the start, in a design phase, what we can do is create net zero buildings at the same cost, or possibly even lower, than doing them the traditional way. Because once a building's active, you're off the gas grid, so you don't have to do the prelim works to bring the gas network into that development. You also don't have to upgrade the electricity network in the area to be able to take on that load. So what we find is that those that kind of prelim work and that ability to not have to wait for the upgrades to the grid mean some developments can roll out faster. And so we're starting to see huge interest now from house builders to say, let's put more active components onto our building as we get better solutions for our tenants, and we're able to roll these things out much more quickly. And those avoided costs offset against the slightly higher capital costs of putting that stuff in from the beginning. With everything that's happening now around society, we're seeing more and more demand growing for this, and it's only going to become faster and faster. You've seen the explosion that's happening now in growth for electric vehicles. We see the same kind of thing happening over the next 5 to 10 years for buildings. And ECA members will absolutely be part of this future. Thank you.